everybody. My name is Laura, and yes, I am Dat Aspie. And today we're going to talk a little bit about coexisting disorders that usually tend to happen alongside of the autism spectrum disorders, and some common misdiagnoses that we might face, especially if you're a woman or a non-binary folk. So when I say coexisting disorders, sometimes people think of that as comorbid disorders. I tend to say coexisting because it sounds less cryptic. And also, it's like, yeah, it just happens to exist alongside of something you're already living with, so might as well call it what it is. I won't go too much into detail, like, why we may end up being more at risk for something. If I do end up touching on it, I won't go, like, super deep into it, but there are some reasons, like, that would be fairly common if you run into this. For example, a lot of times people who are on the autism spectrum have a higher risk of developing anxiety and depression. My guess onto why that is because of all of the bullying and shit that we have to deal with from society because we're not normal. And when you're going through that type of shit, of course you're going to be likely to develop anxiety and or depression. I mean, to be fair, also when it comes to anxiety and depression and things like that, you can end up developing it. Like anybody could, probably, I think. But your brain chemistry with what you're born with, and I think genetics does have a little bit to play with how likely you are to develop these things. So feel free to take this information with a grain of salt with that in mind. Other things that people may end up developing alongside of an autism spectrum disorder include, but do not have to include, ADD, ADHD. Learning disabilities are sometimes common. Gastrointestinal issues. Seizure disorders such as epilepsy, sensory processing disorder, and mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. There are other things that can coexist alongside of autism. I guess realistically anything really could, but some of the lists that I see also include like sleep problems, Fragile X syndrome, hearing impairments, although I think it's more likely that people would experience sensory processing issues, but it depends on the person. Some people with an autism spectrum disorder also end up developing visual impairments as well, but it doesn't have to, like it's not one causes the other or anything like that. It just sometimes coexists. Dyslexia and hyperlexia also could coexist. I mean, maybe not at the same time, but they do sometimes happen in somebody with an autism spectrum disorder. Dyspraxia is another one that could happen because it affects how the brain processes information, and sometimes it affects speech and some motor functions. But at the same time, people on the autism spectrum may or may not have issues with certain motor functions, like we may be a little bit clumsier, or maybe there's some little motor things, like fine motor skills that we just don't have. Down syndrome can also coexist with autism, and that could be where some of the learning difficulties may come into play. It also does play into developmental delays as well, so when the two end up coexisting, I guess that can have its own set of issues or happenings. So some of those disorders I mentioned, while they can coexist with an autism spectrum disorder, they are sometimes what people are misdiagnosed with instead of an autism spectrum disorder. For example, a common issue that women deal with when trying to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, especially if we're on a more mild end of the spectrum, we sometimes get misdiagnosed with things like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression and anxiety, other mental health issues that sometimes are correct diagnoses, but at the same time it doesn't tell the full story of what's happening. Most often when women can easily be diagnosed with autism or an autism spectrum disorder, it's when there's learning difficulties or when their more severe needs are necessary. Basically when it's more obvious and it fits closer to the model that researchers have in young white boys, which is where most of the research on autism is done with, and a lot of behavior observations as well. There's a myth that women are less likely to develop autism than boys, but my problem with that is that, one, that may or may not be the case. We often are very much overlooked, especially, again, if we're in the mild part of the spectrum. And two, that kind of leaves out non-binary and transgender folks who may or may not be autistic. Which in some things that I've read said gender dysphoria may or may not coexist commonly with autism spectrum disorder. We do tend to question social norms, so why wouldn't gender norms be one of those things? I've certainly questioned gender norms quite a bit growing up. I had a period of time where, and I still don't really like it, I don't like wearing skirts. And I never understood why women had to wear skirts. And dress codes don't always make sense to me. I don't know if they ever really did, or if they did, did I convince myself that was the case, or was it I just rolled with it, just okay, whatever, I guess this must be right. But nonetheless, it does happen. And the 1 out of 4 autistic folk being women, it's again, that kind of leaves out your, all your gender identities and your, transgender folks and intersex folks. So I'm wondering if that will end up changing in the near future. I hope so. But it is a problem that women do face. And I suspect that non-white folks would also deal with this situation. More likely girls because, again, women tend to be misdiagnosed more often. But maybe there's a possibility that if you're not white, there may be some issues with getting the health care or the testing or whatever you need, depending on people's biases. And I mean the not good ones. So all in all, there are things that do coexist with autism. Sometimes it is just that cool. That's what's there. But in other cases, and actually in many cases, we often have multiple conditions that we live with. I think I even saw one thing say that most autistic people live with at least 4 conditions in total. I don't know if it's most of them or not. I'd have to double check that, but I'll leave the sources in the links anyway for you to see for yourself. I would say there's usually at least one other thing from what I've noticed, and that's from talking to friends who are on the spectrum and meeting people who are on the spectrum and things like that. I personally live with, not including an autism spectrum disorder, about 4 other conditions, I think. Most of them mental health things, but yeah, that sounds about right. No, actually all of them have to do with mental health in some fashion. I don't know of any physical conditions that I live with besides eczema, which doesn't happen a ton, but when it does happen, it is a big pain, and it's really annoying. But that's usually during times of a lot of stress, a fuck ton of stress. But I'm thinking mostly neurological and mental health sort of things, not so much physical conditions, although gastrointestinal issues can be considered a physical condition, so that's worth looking into as well. Whatever the case, whatever somebody lives with, that never makes us any less human than anybody else. It just also means that maybe there's more things to acknowledge in their medical history or their medical life, and it's just something else that's there that's just a part of who they are, I guess. Particularly in the sense of just how we live our daily lives. It would be worth looking into how autism manifests itself in women and non-binary folks and transgender folks, particularly on the mild to moderate end of the spectrum. Scientifically speaking, there are more parts of a female brain that are dedicated to reading body language or picking up on those things. I guess that's why we might be considered more intuitive than males. But some of those things and figuring out the social cues and all that, or whatever it is, we figure out how to blend in pretty damn well. Sometimes a little too well. And that's one reason I suspect is that people don't understand that, or not enough researchers understand that, and that's something that should be looked into more. And again, the risk of developing other mental health issues comes from the stigma, comes from the bullying, the isolation, misunderstandings. Some people may have very traumatic experiences with therapies. That can lead us to be more likely to develop mental health issues, on top of any other factors that might be the case, like home life and genetics and things like that. Brain chemistry's complicated, man. If you want to learn more about the coexisting conditions that tend to exist with autism, I'll leave links in the description for articles that I found very helpful. This may not be the most informative episode out of what I have, but you know what? It is what it is. And if you have any topics that you would like me to cover specifically, leave them in the comments below. There's a possibility I might be covering it in the future, but it's still worth asking about anyway, so why not? And as always, take care, everybody. Stay safe. And until next time, thank you so much for coming by.